Divorce was the best thing that ever happened to my children. Saying it out loud still feels like dropping something heavy onto a glass table. That small, sharp pause right after, when the room holds its breath because it isn't sure whether the surface will crack. But that's the truth I've carried for years without daring to name it. I didn't tell friends, I didn't tell family, I didn't even admit it to myself until recently, when the noise in my life finally thinned out enough for honesty to echo without being drowned. It goes against every script we're taught. You're supposed to keep the family together. You're supposed to endure for the kids. You're supposed to hold the house up even when the beams are rotting. And for the longest time, I repeated those lines, played that role, convinced myself that holding on made me strong, responsible, selfless. But underneath all that, beneath the birthday photos and shared dinners and matching holiday outfits, there was this constant pressure behind my ribs, a tightness I learned to ignore, the kind you don't notice until you stop and realize it's been there for years, shaping the way you breathe. I kept telling myself that children need a whole home, that the cracks don't show as much as you think, that they don't hear the tone, the quiet resentment, the clipped replies. But they heard everything. Kids always do. I think deep down I knew they were learning how to swallow tension before they learned to tie their shoes. I saw it in the way they moved around us, careful, measured, like they were trying not to trigger something neither of us admitted was always on the verge of happening. I used to tell myself that staying was noble, that leaving would break them. But the truth, the one I've never spoken until now, is simpler and uglier. The house was already broken. We were living inside a collapsed structure, pretending the walls were still standing, teaching them to pretend along with us. Divorce didn't destroy their home. It freed them from watching two people slowly harden in front of each other. And for years I've carried that knowledge quietly, pretending I stayed for them, when all I did was model a kind of silent unhappiness I never wanted them to copy. I don't expect anyone to agree with me. I know how this sounds, but I'm not here to convince. I'm just tired of lying to myself about what really saved them. I used to think there had to be some dramatic explanation for what I felt, some hidden cruelty in our past, some sharp memory that could justify the heaviness that lived between us. But there wasn't. That's the part that still unsettles me when I look back at those years. Nothing catastrophic ever happened. Our life was ordinary in the way people praise as stability. We had a small house with a garden that always needed trimming, a car that sometimes stalled in the winter, quiet dinners where we talked about groceries and work schedules, weekends spent doing chores that felt like rituals just because everyone else did them too. From the outside, it was the kind of life people point to and say, "This is how you raise children properly." The bills were paid, the birthdays were celebrated, the fridge was full. There was no screaming, no slamming doors, no dramatic scenes to traumatize anyone. And maybe that's why the children never quite knew how to name what was wrong, because nothing was wrong in the ways people look for when they talk about unhappy families. Everything looked exactly the way it should, but inside that neat picture, there was this constant dullness, a kind of emotional fog that settled between us long before anyone dared to notice it. We moved around each other like people sharing a workspace, polite, efficient, mostly silent. There were days when I'd come home, hang up my coat, kiss her on the cheek out of habit, and feel absolutely nothing shift inside me. Not good, not bad, just nothing. We laughed sometimes, but it always felt slightly delayed, like the sound had to travel through a long hallway before reaching either of us. The kids would crawl onto the couch between us with their books or toys, and we would smile at the right moments, nod, ask questions. A picture-perfect evening. Perfect. Yet I remember watching them sometimes as they watched us. their eyes flicking back and forth like they were reading a room that never quite matched the script we performed. They were too young to articulate it, but old enough to sense the static in the air. They didn't see fights, so they assumed this was how grown-ups lived. Being polite, being distant, being resigned. I think that's what eats at me the most now. Not the arguments we avoided, but the affection that never filled the silence. Because there were no storms, they learned to live in a kind of gray weather, the kind you don't question because it's always been there. And I let myself believe that as long as the house was calm, the children were fine. But calm isn't the same as peaceful. Sometimes calm is just two people quietly withdrawing from each other while pretending the kids can't tell the difference. I used to think normalcy would protect them. But normalcy has its own dangers. It teaches you to stop expecting warmth. And that was the life they watched us model day after day, without us even noticing what it was turning them into. I played my role well, maybe too well. It's strange to admit that now, but I think I became so good at performing the part of a committed spouse and responsible parent that I stopped noticing how little of it was actually felt. I woke up early, packed lunches, checked homework, repaired broken toys, drove them to school, to practice, to birthday parties, all the small, expected duties that make a parent look dependable. And I was dependable. I showed up, I signed the forms, I helped with the costumes for school plays, even when I hated the glue and the glitter sticking to my hands. I said all the right words at parent-teacher conferences, nodding like a man who believed every sentence he spoke, and she was the same in her own way. We functioned like a well-coordinated team, passing responsibilities back and forth without complaint. People envied our stability. They said things like, "You two really have it figured out." I used to feel a small swell of pride when I heard that, not because it was true, but because it meant the performance was convincing. But underneath all those neatly executed tasks, the emotional thread had already snapped. I remember the micro moments most clearly now, not the big events. The way she would pause before handing me a cup of coffee, like she was waiting to see who I was going to be that morning. The way the kids looked relieved when we managed to laugh at the same joke. The way I hugged them, quick, light, functional, like I was checking something off a list rather than reaching for them. There was a night when my daughter sat beside me on the couch with a school project. She wanted my help choosing colors for a poster. I pointed, made suggestions, even complimented her choices. She smiled, leaned against me for a second, and I felt my whole body go stiff, like someone had touched a part of me I'd forgotten existed. I didn't push her away. I didn't tell her to move, but I didn't soften either. I just stayed frozen until she shifted back, none the wiser. That moment comes back to me more often than I'd like to admit, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it showed me how rehearsed I'd become, how much of my love was just muscle memory, a sequence of gestures copied from what I thought a good parent was supposed to do, and she and we played our marital roles with the same detached precision. We ate dinner together every night, sitting across from each other, exchanging updates like colleagues. Sometimes our hands brushed when we reached for the salt or passed a plate, and every time there was that same tiny hesitation, the smallest pause, like our bodies didn't recognize each other anymore. I ignored it. She ignored it. We kept assigning meaning to the routine because it was easier than admitting the truth. We were two people raising children together, not two people connected to each other. And the children felt it, even if they couldn't articulate it. They watched us navigate a house where duty replaced intimacy, where care was performed, not shared. I didn't realize then how much damage that quiet distance was doing. I was too busy convincing myself that consistency was enough, that fulfilling the role was the same as living it. Looking back, I can see how much of my life was spent in that strange middle place, present in the room, absent in the feeling. A parent, a partner, but not really there in any way that mattered. It didn't fall apart in one moment. There was no dramatic fight, no slammed door, no night when one of us finally said what had been sitting between us for years. It happened the way metal bends after too many winters, quietly, slowly, until one day it just doesn't bend back anymore. I remember the morning it finally came into focus, though. Not because anything special happened, but because something inside me stopped trying to reinterpret the same signs I'd been ignoring for so long. I was standing in the hallway, tying my shoes, and I heard her in the kitchen humming over the sound of the kettle. A normal sound, something I'd heard thousands of times. But this time it felt like background noise in someone else's home. I looked at the framed photos lining the wall, vacations, birthdays, posed smiles, and for the first time I didn't feel attached to any of them. Not in the way you're supposed to, not even in the nostalgic way people talk about when they say life goes too fast. I felt like I was staring at documentation instead of memories, like I had been present for the pictures but absent from the life inside them. That same week, our son came home with a drawing he'd made in class, us together holding hands. He was so proud of it. He placed it on the fridge with both hands, smoothing the edges carefully, and then he looked at me, waiting for my reaction, and I said the right things. I smiled. I told him it was beautiful. But his eyes stayed on me, searching for something more, some warmth that didn't come, and after a few seconds he just nodded like he'd found his answer in the empty space between us. Later that night, I found myself standing in the doorway of the living room while she sat on the couch reading. That tiny hesitation before she looked up, that split second where her face was neutral, cautious, unguarded, told me everything I had been refusing to accept. It wasn't anger, it wasn't bitterness, it was resignation. A quiet recognition that whatever bond we once had was now thinner than the pages she was turning. She asked if I needed something. I said no, but something about that moment lingered, like a cold draft you can't find the source of. Over the next days, the realization kept coming back in different shapes. The way the children spoke more freely when one of us wasn't in the room, the way she and I navigated the house like travelers in a station, crossing paths without really meeting, the way silence settled into the corners even when the TV was on. And then one morning, I woke up and felt this weight in my chest, not heavy like panic, but heavy like truth. The kind of heaviness that doesn't ask for attention. It just waits for you to stop pretending you don't feel it. I sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, and for the first time I let the thought form fully without pushing it away. The children would be better off if we ended this, not later, not when it became unbearable now, while there was still time for them to grow up without learning the shape of our distance as their template for love. I didn't say anything that day, I didn't even hint at it, but once that thought settled in, everything else looked different, sharper, honest. I watched her move around the house with that tired softness that comes from trying too hard for too long. I watched the children trying to decode our silences like they were preparing for an exam, and I realized it wasn't one moment that cracked everything. It was the accumulation of thousands of small, quiet truths finally becoming too loud to ignore. I didn't break the marriage. I just stopped holding up something that had collapsed years before. The part that still follows me, even now, is how calm the realization felt. No rage, no grief, just clarity. Like waking up from a long sleep and seeing the room in its real light. After the divorce, the house felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. Not empty. Emptiness has a certain sharpness to it, but more like a room after a long, crowded gathering. when the air is still warm from the people who were there, but the silence has already claimed everything. I remember sitting at the kitchen table on the first night alone, the light above me humming softly, and realizing I didn't know what to do with my hands. For years, they had always been busy with something, handing over a plate, folding laundry, fixing small things that didn't need fixing. And now they just rested there, as if waiting for instructions. The kids adjusted faster than I did. They settled into the rhythm of two homes with a kind of quiet resilience I didn't expect. They laughed more freely. They moved with less caution. They didn't watch our faces as closely. I noticed it during the first few drop-offs, the way their shoulders relaxed when they stepped into her place, the way their eyes softened when they hugged her, the way they didn't brace themselves for the tension that used to linger in every shared space. And it wasn't painful to see, not really. It was confirming, a mirror held up to the truth I had spent years avoiding. They were better without the weight of our performance pressing on them. They were lighter, quicker to smile, more open. And I realized then that the thing I had feared most, breaking the family, had already happened long before the papers were signed. The divorce didn't fracture anything. It just acknowledged what had been fractured quietly, invisibly, under the surface. People like to talk about healing after a separation, as if it's a grand arc, a clean resolution. But my life didn't become a story after she left. It just became quieter. There were evenings when I sat alone on the couch and felt a kind of stillness I didn't know how to name. Not sadness, not relief, something in between. A space where I could finally hear myself without the noise of pretending. And with that quiet came the harder truth. I had spent so long being distant, so long living beside emotion rather than inside it, that I didn't know how to build anything new from the rubble. I wasn't suddenly better. I wasn't suddenly open. I was just a man with fewer excuses left. Sometimes I catch myself wondering how different things could have been if I had learned earlier to pay attention to the small moments. The way she used to wait for me to notice her new haircut, the way the kids looked for signs of warmth in my eyes, the way the house held its breath around us. But wondering doesn't change anything. It just fills the silence. What matters, what I keep returning to in this new pared-down life, is that they're doing okay. Not perfect, not untouched, but okay in a way they never seemed when we were all under the same roof. They don't carry that subtle tension in their voices anymore. They laugh without checking who's listening, and I know without needing anyone to tell me that leaving gave them a chance to grow up without carrying our quiet unhappiness as their inheritance. I don't tell them any of this. I don't tell anyone. This is the kind of truth that doesn't belong in family conversations or holiday dinners. It belongs here, in the privacy of spoken words no one asked for. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect to be understood. I don't even expect this to make sense to anyone but me. But saying it matters. Letting it exist outside my head matters. Divorce was the best thing that ever happened to my children. Not because I was brave or wise or selfless. I wasn't any of those things. It's just the plain reality of a life that went wrong quietly, a life that kept going anyway. Now I sit in this smaller home with fewer photos on the walls and more space between the hours, and I accept that some truths don't fix anything. They don't heal. They just sit beside you, steady and unmovable. And somehow that's enough. Not comfort, not closure, just truth finally spoken, settling into the room like dust you can finally see in the light.